I'm Ethan Erickson, and this is the Long March of History. So, today I'm going to be talking about the social contract and why it's a big lie. So, for anyone unaware, social contract theory is the idea that we all got together and we decided we're going to voluntarily give up some of our rights to the government in order for the government to protect our rights. And, well, first of all, this is a lie just because this isn't how governments are formed. Throughout the vast majority of history, governments are not formed even remotely on the idea of social contract theory. In fact, social contract theory wasn't invented for a long time prior to the a long time until after the invention of the government, so it doesn't really make sense that we like the all these governments that have arose since then. Prior. Well, today is not my day. Prior to then, would have had any idea of this theory or would have formed themselves around this theory or would have respected this theory if the theory itself didn't exist. So, obviously that's one reason why it's wrong, but you could still say, well, today's societies, well, they still operate off of social contract theory. And this, even if social contract theory is true, it's still a load of crap, and I'll explain why. So, for instance, let's take the idea that society, this is something voluntarily entered into. And this self-evidently isn't the case. So I can't think of a single time really where the government has said hey, do you want to enter into the social contract? Except maybe with immigrants, but even there I still wouldn't count it. But basically, it's like no one at the age of 18 ever was like, hey, you want the do you want to be subject to the government's whims? If so, sign here. And no, that didn't happen. We all know that didn't happen. It's just not the case. And like very like very few people, if ever, have voluntarily entered into this supposed social contract. We have the founders. They met at Philadelphia and they signed onto that constitution. And we also had the ratifying convention. But beyond that, in today's modern world, all those people are long dead. The ones who signed the Constitution and consented to all this, they're gone. They're dead. No one today has signed on to that. I'm not saying there are people who, if people were asked to sign on, that they wouldn't. I'm sure there's still a decent portion of people who would sign into the contract, but that's largely irrelevant because that's not how it works. Instead of having this social contract, which we all have to agree upon, it's just assumed. It's like, oh no, you're part of the country. Well, we get to do whatever we want, and we're gonna. These are the rules you have to abide by. And so, in defense of the social contract, people sometimes argue, hey, you're allowed to move. This is an incredibly stupid argument. let me basically explain it with an analogy, which is, you have your home, and you're sitting there doing your own thing. Suddenly, Bob starts aerating your lawn, and he also starts killing the weeds. He does this without your consent or your knowledge. And then he says, hey, because you're sitting there and I'm aerating your lawn and killing the weeds, you now have to obey all the rules I dictate. And it's like, What do you mean? I I don't understand. Why would I have to obey your rules? He's like, well, I'm aerating your lawn, don't you see? And I'm killing the weeds. You're subject to my rules now. And it's like, I didn't ask for your service. And he's like, well, I don't care. I'm gonna force you to obey my rules. And don't worry, I'll take your advice and your input. I am gonna do a whole another video on democracy, so we're not gonna get into that. But still, the uh, the idea that you are somehow and then he's like, okay, look, because I just remembered why I was going off on that analogy. Okay, yeah, he's like, well, if you don't want to be subject to my rules, just move. And he does this to the whole city, then the whole country, etc. He's like, look, I've aerated your lawn, and I've also killed all the weeds, so you have to. Like, you have to obey my rules, or you can move. And the whole thing is, you didn't agree to the rules in the first place, and you didn't agree to the initial service. Therefore, you are not required to obey those rules because you didn't want the service. You never asked for the service, and you also didn't agree that if the service was going to be given to you, that you had to abide by that set of rules. That's the same thing as if I were to buy a product from someone and suddenly they're imposing all the rules. It doesn't matter if I paid for the aerator or not. If in the agreement originally I didn't consent to the rules. So the idea that, well, the government made the roads, so you have to abide by all the government's rules, especially on your own property and how you interact with people and all that, it's self-evidently just a garbage idea. Like, I know that's a bit condescending, but I don't see how it logically follows that any of this would make sense. And also, the idea that the government is going to protect your rights, well, it's like, okay, we'll protect your rights. That's a message, and you'll give up a few of your rights over here. But that's like the complete opposite of what's occurring, really, is that the government gives you a few tiny little rights over here, and then it infringes, and grows faster and faster and faster. You see this just about everywhere. You see that the government's the main mechanism of government that keeps it functioning is the infringement of rights through taxation. It's a very messed up mechanism. It's like, oh, by the way, we're going to, like, in order for it to function, it must necessarily infringe upon rights. Well, the end goal in which it states is that it will protect your rights. And it's like, obviously there can be a better system in which you can protect my rights without infringing upon my rights, hence private security. Private security doesn't have this contradictory mechanism where in which it's simultaneously, I will protect your rights as my highest goal, while also saying, in order to protect your rights, I must necessarily violate your rights. It's like that idea that the government protects your rights and all that is rather I find amusing considering the fact. Also, like, the idea that the social contract would still be in effect is also an amusing one, because with any contract, if one side fails to uphold their end of the contract, the other side is no longer required to uphold theirs. The contract becomes null. We all accept this. If I go into Taco Bell and I make an order, and then I refuse to pay the price, I no longer get the meal. But this isn't social contract theory falls flat here, because if the government refuses to uphold their end of protecting my rights, well, the government doesn't care. They're still going to demand you uphold your end. So, it, like, it's obviously one-sided. Like, this isn't a contract between individuals or individuals in an abstract entity, which I could do a whole video on that, but rather it is the imposition of the government's will with these language and rhetoric that surrounds it to give the illusion of choice and the illusion of this being voluntary when it could not be further from the case. The government also, like, you can't opt out. With a contract you have to that you would voluntarily enter into, you can opt out of the contract. Like, if the government, well, so if I decide, look, let's pretend government's upholding its end of the contract, which it doesn't. Let's just say, for whatever reason, somehow the government actually keeps its end of the bargain. If I don't want to be part of the contract, I would merely say, okay, I don't want to be part of the contract, I'm not going to uphold my end, you don't have to uphold your end. Neither of us are now, like, the contract becomes nullified, and now I and the government are no longer under this association. So I would just become my own private individual, released from, with my property, released from government control. But this isn't the case. Under the current system, there is no right to individual secession. If you try to individually secede, government will laugh at you, and they might play along like, you're your own little micronation over there, like they do in Nevada for that one guy, but they're still like, you'll have to pay us tribute taxes, and by the way, if you start disobeying your laws, guess what? We're still gonna show up with guys with guns and possibly kill you. So, this idea that it, like, the idea of the social contract is flawed on almost every level. It's just that we're taught this from a very young age, and so and we're also taught that, well, if you do that, you're an extreme. Like, if you hold this point of view, you're an extremist. So and we're also taught to have an aversion to extremism. So therefore, what happens is we don't want to, like, our minds, like, these are dots that can easily connect, but we don't want those dots to connect because we have a negative aversion to it because of how we're taught in our childhood. And that feeds into everyone just going along and saying, oh, this is the social contract, it's what we all wanted. And self-evidently, this isn't the case. And, like, you notice this a whole lot. It's like, well, okay, I'm gonna actually, that part actually would get into the problem with democracy, which is going to be a whole nother video, because obviously I don't want this video to be just me rambling off topic for, I don't know, 10 to 15 minutes. Okay, well, the video so far is only like, what, 14 minutes? So it's not going to be rambling on for that much longer. But yeah, I had another point. I'll think of it later and probably just, like, put it in another video. Anyways, this is Ethan Erickson. This is the Long March of Liberty. Vote for me 2040 presidential election. Yeah.